What you're about to witness will change everything you think you know about communication, connection, and the power of understanding without words. This is the story of how a silent conversation between a young girl and a royal guard proved that some of the most profound connections happen when spoken language fails, but human hearts find another way to speak. 8-year-old Sophie Mitchell experienced the world differently than most people. Colors seemed brighter to her, sounds came in waves that sometimes overwhelmed her sensitive ears, and crowds felt like storms of sensation that could leave her breathless and shaking. But Sophie had something that many adults had lost: the ability to see straight through to the heart of things, unfiltered by social expectations or learned prejudices. The morning visit to Buckingham Palace had not been Sophie's idea. Her parents, Mark and Sarah Mitchell, had planned this London trip for months, carefully researching autism-friendly attractions and preparing Sophie for each new experience with the detailed advance preparation that made unfamiliar situations manageable for her. The Royal Guard ceremony was supposed to be perfect, predictable, structured, with clear routines that Sophie could observe and understand. But what none of them had expected was the connection that would form between Sophie and the tall, silent figure standing at his post. Guard James Harrison had been on duty for 2 hours when the Mitchell family approached his section of the palace courtyard. In his 3 years of Royal Guard service, Harrison had developed the ability to catalog visitors with peripheral awareness while maintaining his ceremonial stillness. Families with children, elderly tourists, international visitors with cameras. They all blended into the background noise of his professional attention. Sophie was different. She stood apart from the crowd, her hands pressed firmly over her ears to block out the chaos of voices and camera clicks that surrounded the ceremonial area. Her parents hovered nearby with the careful watchfulness of people accustomed to monitoring their child's sensory overload levels. But Sophie's attention was fixed with laser intensity on something everyone else was taking for granted: the perfect stillness of the Royal Guard. While other children pointed and giggled and asked their parents why the soldier wouldn't move, Sophie stared with the concentrated focus that neurotypical people often mistake for rudeness, but which actually represents the most honest form of human observation. She was seeing everything: the controlled breathing, the microscopic adjustments that maintained perfect posture, the way Harrison's eyes moved constantly while his body remained motionless. Most importantly, she was seeing something that the chattering crowds around her missed entirely. Harrison was working. This wasn't a performance or a tourist attraction or a living statue meant for entertainment. This was a professional doing his job with extraordinary skill and dedication. "Mum," Sophie said, her voice carrying that particular flatness that marked her speech when she was processing complex thoughts. "The soldier is concentrating very hard, like when I'm building my train sets." Everyone is being too loud. Sarah Mitchell looked at her daughter with the mixture of pride and protective concern that defined every moment of their relationship. Sophie's observations were always accurate, always perceptive, but they often revealed truths that made social situations uncomfortable. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied quietly. "He is working very hard. We should be respectful and quiet so he can do his job." But Sophie was already moving, walking with the purposeful determination that seized her when she had identified something that needed to be fixed. The crowd around Harrison's post was typical for a Tuesday morning: tourists jostling for the best photo angles, children asking loud questions, adults discussing the historical significance of Royal Guard traditions without bothering to lower their voices. Sophie walked through them all with the single-minded focus of someone on a mission. She stopped exactly 6 feet from Harrison's position, close enough to be clearly visible to him, far enough away to respect the boundaries that protocol required. And then she did something that stopped conversations around her and drew the attention of everyone within 50 yards. She sat down on the cobblestones, crossed her legs in perfect lotus position, and became completely still. The silence that radiated from her small form was so complete it seemed to create a bubble of calm in the chaos of tourist activity. Sophie's hands rested palm up on her knees, her breathing slowed to match the measured rhythm she had observed in Harrison's chest, and her eyes fixed on his face with unwavering attention. She was mirroring him, not mockingly, not as performance, but with the absolute sincerity that came from recognizing a kindred spirit. Someone else who understood the power of stillness, the discipline of focus, the importance of doing one thing perfectly rather than many things carelessly. Harrison noticed immediately. How could he not? In 3 years of ceremonial duty, no one had ever responded to his professional stillness with matching stillness. Children usually grew bored and wandered away. Adults took their photos and moved on to the next attraction. But this small girl with the serious expression and the careful posture was offering him something unprecedented: companionship in solitude. The recognition was mutual and immediate. Here was someone who understood that stillness wasn't emptiness, but fullness. That silence wasn't absence, but presence. That what looked like nothing to casual observers was actually everything to those who knew how to see. For 20 minutes, they sat together in their separate stillnesses. Sophie on the cobblestones, Harrison at his post. Neither moving, both completely present, connected by an understanding that transcended the need for words or gestures or any of the usual social rituals that neurotypical people use to bridge the gaps between individuals. The crowd around them began to change. Parents pulled their children closer, speaking in whispers instead of normal voices. Cameras were lowered as people sensed they were witnessing something sacred, something that shouldn't be disturbed or diminished by casual documentation. An elderly woman approached the Mitchell parents, her voice soft with wonder. "Your daughter is remarkable. Look what she's done. Everyone's being quieter, more respectful. It's like she's teaching them how to behave around someone who's working." Sarah Mitchell looked at her daughter with new understanding. Sophie wasn't just sitting quietly to avoid overstimulation. She was actively creating the environment that would allow both herself and the guard to exist comfortably in their shared space. She was solving a problem that most adults hadn't even recognized existed. Then something extraordinary happened. Harrison, without moving his head or breaking his ceremonial posture, allowed his gaze to drift downward until it met Sophie's eyes. The contact lasted only seconds, but in that brief connection, an entire conversation took place. Sophie's face, which had been serious and concentrated, suddenly brightened with the most genuine smile anyone had seen from her all morning. Not the careful, performed smile she used in social situations to make neurotypical people comfortable, but the radiant expression of pure joy that came from being truly understood by another person. Harrison's response was imperceptible to everyone except Sophie. The slightest softening around his eyes, the microscopic deepening of focus that indicated he was seeing not just a tourist child, but a fellow practitioner of the discipline of attention. In that moment, two very different minds found common ground in the space where words were unnecessary, and understanding flowed through shared appreciation of focus, discipline, and the power of being completely present in a single moment. The connection was so pure, so unexpected, and so moving that several tourists found themselves wiping away tears without fully understanding why they were crying. They were witnessing something rare, the moment when two people who experienced the world differently discovered that their differences led them to the same essential truth about dignity, respect, and the profound peace that comes from doing one thing perfectly. The morning sun climbed higher in the London sky, but neither Sophie nor Harrison seemed aware of the changing light. Their connection had created a pocket of timelessness in the middle of the busy tourist attraction, a space where two minds that processed the world differently had found perfect synchronization. Mark Mitchell watched his daughter with amazement that bordered on disbelief. In 8 years of being Sophie's father, he had never seen her maintain such prolonged, peaceful focus in a crowded public space. Usually, by this point in any outing, she would be stimming, hand flapping, or rocking, or making the quiet vocal sounds that helped her regulate her nervous system when sensory input became overwhelming. Instead, she sat in perfect stillness, her breathing synchronized with the guards, her attention unwavering. She had found something in Harrison's disciplined presence that her nervous system recognized as safe, predictable, trustworthy. The crowd around them had transformed as well. What had started as typical tourist chaos, loud conversations, children running between adults' legs, the constant click and flash of cameras, had evolved into something resembling reverence. People were speaking in whispers, moving more carefully, showing the kind of respect usually reserved for churches or museums. Sophie had accomplished what dozens of security barriers and posted signs could not. She had made a crowd of strangers understand that they were in the presence of someone doing important work that deserved their consideration. A young mother approached the Mitchell family, her voice soft with wonder. "Excuse me," she said to Sarah, "but what your daughter is doing, it's extraordinary. My son has ADHD, and he's never been able to sit still for more than 5 minutes in his entire life. But watching her, he's been quiet for 20 minutes. How does she do it?" Sarah looked at her daughter with the mixture of pride and protective concern that defined every moment of their relationship. "Sophie sees things differently," she replied quietly. "She notices patterns and rhythms that most of us miss. I think she recognized that the guard was working very hard to maintain his focus, and she wanted to support him in her own way." The young mother nodded, her eyes moving between Sophie and her own son, who stood transfixed by the unusual scene. "It's like she's teaching him something. Teaching all of us something about respect, attention." That was exactly what Sophie was doing, though she would never have described it in those terms. In her mind, she was simply sharing space with someone who understood the value of doing one thing perfectly. Someone whose nervous system, like hers, functioned best when external chaos was minimized and internal focus was maximized. But something else was beginning to happen. Sophie's right hand, which had been resting palm up on her knee, began to move with slow, deliberate precision. Her fingers formed shapes that looked like random gestures to most observers, but carried specific meaning for anyone who knew how to read them. Harrison noticed immediately. His training in observation and threat assessment meant he cataloged every movement, every change in the crowd around his post. But this wasn't threat assessment anymore. This was recognition of something extraordinary. Sophie was using sign language, not fluent, conversational sign language, but the basic alphabet and simple words she had learned in speech therapy. Letters formed with careful precision, spelling out a message that only someone trained in visual communication would understand. THNKYOU. The message was clear, deliberate, and directed specifically at Harrison. Sophie had found a way to communicate across the barrier of protocol and ceremonial duty that prevented verbal conversation. She was acknowledging his work, expressing gratitude for his service, offering the kind of recognition that soldiers rarely receive from the people they protect. Harrison's response came without conscious thought. While maintaining his ceremonial stillness, his left hand, the one not gripping his rifle, shifted position against his uniform. To casual observers, it looked like a minor adjustment of posture. But Sophie saw it for what it was, a reply in the same silent language she had used. YOUREWELCOME. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but its impact was profound. Two people who lived in a world designed primarily for neurotypical communication had found a way to bridge the gap between their respective duties and limitations. Sophie couldn't speak loudly enough to be heard over the crowd without triggering her own sensory overload. Harrison couldn't break protocol to engage in conversation with tourists, but they could sign to each other. Quietly, respectfully, without disturbing the ceremonial dignity of Harrison's post or the careful emotional regulation that Sophie needed to maintain. The conversation continued, slow and deliberate and beautiful in its simplicity. Sophie signed questions about his work, his training, whether standing still for so long was difficult. Harrison responded with answers about duty, discipline, and the honor of serving something larger than oneself. Most of the crowd remained unaware that this extraordinary communication was happening, but a few observant visitors began to notice the subtle hand movements, the way Sophie's face lit up when she received responses, the microscopic changes in Harrison's posture that indicated active engagement despite his ceremonial stillness. A tourist from Japan, himself fluent in sign language due to a deaf daughter, began translating quietly for his wife. Words spread in whispers through the crowd. The little girl and the guard were having a conversation. A real conversation, despite the barriers of autism, protocol, and the chaos of a public tourist attraction. "She's asking him if he gets scared," the Japanese tourist whispered to his wife, watching Sophie's careful finger movements. "She wants to know if standing so still helps him when he feels overwhelmed." Harrison's response was longer this time, his hand moving with practiced efficiency as he explained that military discipline had taught him to find calm in structure, peace in routine, strength in focusing on one task at a time. Everything that Sophie's occupational therapists had been trying to teach her for years, but expressed in the language of duty and service rather than medical intervention. Sophie's smile could have powered the city of London. Here was someone who understood not just her need for structure and routine, but who had built an entire career around those same principles. Someone who proved that the things that made her different could also make her strong. She signed a final message, her fingers moving with the careful precision of someone expressing something vitally important. "You help me feel safe." Harrison's response broke every protocol guideline he had ever learned. While maintaining his perfect posture and ceremonial stillness, he allowed his face to soften into the slightest smile. Not the broad grin that would compromise his professional bearing, but the gentle expression of acknowledgement that one human being gives to another when words is spoken or signed, have created genuine connection. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras, but none of the resulting photographs would adequately convey what had actually happened. They would show a little girl sitting quietly near a royal guard, both appearing peaceful and focused. But they couldn't capture the conversation that had bridged to different ways of experiencing the world, or the mutual recognition between two people who had found strength in what others saw as limitations. As the morning progressed toward noon, both Sophie and Harrison began to show signs that their shared meditation was drawing to a natural close. Sophie's stimming behaviors, the gentle hand flapping and quiet vocal sounds that helped her regulate her nervous system, began to return as she prepared to transition back to the sensory complexity of normal tourist activity. Harrison's shift was ending as well, his replacement already moving into position for the formal changing of the guard. But before the ceremony began, before protocol required his return to regulation behavior, he had one final message for the remarkable young girl who had given him the gift of understood silence. With movements so subtle that only Sophie could read them, he signed, "Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the best conversation happens without words." Sophie's response was pure joy, a radiant smile that transformed her serious face into something luminous combined with enthusiastic hand flapping that had nothing to do with sensory regulation and everything to do with the happiness of being truly understood by another person. The changing of the guard ceremony began around them, but for Sophie and Harrison, the most important exchange had already taken place. The changing of the guard ceremony unfolded with its usual precision, but something had fundamentally shifted in the atmosphere around Harrison's post. The crowd that had gathered to watch Sophie and Harrison's silent conversation now observed the formal military ritual with a different quality of attention. They had been taught by an 8-year-old girl with autism what it meant to truly witness someone performing their duty with dedication and skill. As Harrison prepared for his formal march to the guardhouse, he faced a dilemma that wasn't covered in any military manual. Protocol demanded that he maintain his ceremonial bearing throughout the transition, acknowledging no individual tourists or personal interactions. But Sophie had given him something precious, a reminder that his service touched individual lives in ways he never saw or knew about. Sophie understood that their extraordinary conversation was ending. Her parents had begun the careful transition process they used to help her navigate changes in routine, gentle verbal preparation, clear explanations of what would happen next, patient support for the sensory adjustments required when moving from one activity to another. But she had one final message for Harrison, something that had taken her the entire morning to formulate in the careful, precise way that her mind processed important thoughts. As Harrison began his regulation turn to march away from his post, Sophie stood up from her lotus position for the first time in 2 hours. The movement was fluid, controlled, showing none of the stiffness that typically came after long periods of stillness. Her connection with Harrison's disciplined presence had somehow extended to her own physical comfort. With her parents watching in amazement, Sophie stepped forward to the exact boundary that protocol allowed, close enough to be clearly visible to Harrison, far enough to respect the ceremonial space that his duty required. Then she began to sign, but not the simple alphabet letters they had been using for their conversation. This was formal sign language, the kind taught in advanced classes, requiring precise hand shapes and fluid movements that Sophie had never demonstrated before. Somehow, in the space of their shared stillness, she had accessed language skills that her therapists had been working on for years without success. The message she signed was complex, multi-layered, expressing concepts that most 8-year-olds struggled to articulate even in their native spoken language. Thank you for showing me that being different can be a strength. Thank you for proving that the things that make me need quiet and focus are the same things that make you good at protecting people. Thank you for helping me understand that I am not broken. I am just built for different kinds of important work. Harrison received every word, his trained eye following her movements with the kind of attention usually reserved for threat assessment and tactical communication. But this wasn't military intelligence. This was something far more precious, the gratitude of a young person who had discovered that her neurological differences weren't obstacles to overcome but tools that could be developed and honored. His response came in the form of a salute that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. Not the casual acknowledgement that guards sometimes offered to distinguished visitors, but the full, formal salute that soldiers render to civilians who have served their country with distinction. In that gesture, Harrison was acknowledging something profound. Sophie's courage in navigating a world not designed for her neurology was its own form of service. Her determination to find connection across barriers of communication and understanding was its own kind of bravery. Her gift for teaching others about respect and attention and the value of focused presence was its own contribution to the common good. The salute lasted exactly 3 seconds, but its impact would echo through Sophie's life forever. She had been recognized by someone whose opinion mattered as worthy of respect not despite her autism, but because of how she had learned to work with her unique neurology to create something beautiful in the world. Sophie's response was pure joy expressed in the language that came most naturally to her, enthusiastic stimming that had nothing to do with anxiety or overwhelm and everything to do with happiness so profound it had to be expressed through movement. She flapped her hands and rocked on her toes and made the quiet vocal sounds that were her way of celebrating when words weren't sufficient for the magnitude of what she was feeling. The crowd around them burst into spontaneous applause, but it wasn't the kind of applause typically offered at tourist attractions. This was the recognition of witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when two people who experienced the world differently had found common ground in values that transcended neurology. Discipline, respect, dedication, and the courage to be fully present in each moment. As Harrison completed his march to the guardhouse, Sophie turned to her parents with an expression of accomplishment that they had never seen before. She had successfully navigated a complex social interaction entirely on her own terms, using skills that played to her strengths rather than requiring her to mask or suppress her natural ways of being. "Mum," she said, her voice carrying the flat tone that marked her speech when she was processing important realizations, "I want to learn more sign language. And I want to learn about military history. The Guard taught me that discipline and focus are superpowers." Sarah Mitchell looked at her daughter with tears in her eyes, understanding that they had just witnessed Sophie's first real glimpse of her own potential. Not the potential to become more neurotypical, but the potential to develop her unique strengths into something that could make the world better. "We'll find you classes," she promised, "both sign language and military history. You're right, discipline and focus are superpowers. And you're already developing them." The walk back to their hotel that afternoon was different from any family outing they had experienced before. Sophie maintained the calm, centered energy that her interaction with Harrison had cultivated. She pointed out details in London architecture with the same focused attention she had brought to observing the Guard. She moved through crowds with newfound confidence, no longer seeing her need for structure and quiet as limitations, but as tools that helped her perceive things others missed. That evening, Sophie sat at the hotel room desk with her sketch pad, carefully drawing pictures of Royal Guards and writing out the sign language alphabet with meticulous precision. Her parents watched in amazement as she worked with sustained focus, creating art that captured not just the visual details of what she had seen, but the emotional truth of connection across difference. But the story didn't end there. The next morning brought an envelope delivered to their hotel, heavy paper bearing the Royal Guard insignia. Inside was a formal certificate, signed by Harrison's commanding officer, designating Sophie as an honorary friend of the Royal Guard in recognition of her outstanding demonstration of respect, discipline, and exemplary behavior during ceremonial duties. With the certificate was a personal note from Harrison, written in careful handwriting that spoke of military precision applied to civilian courtesy. "Dear Sophie, thank you for teaching me that some of the most important conversations happen without words. Your focus and respect reminded me why I chose this profession. You have the qualities that make great soldiers: attention to detail, commitment to doing things correctly, and the courage to be yourself even when the world seems chaotic. I hope you continue to develop these strengths. They will take you places that will amaze everyone who knows you." Sophie read the note 3 times, her finger tracing each word with the careful attention she brought to everything important in her life. Then she looked up at her parents with the determined expression that they recognized as the precursor to significant decisions. "I want to write him back," she said, "and I want to learn everything about military service and sign language and how to help other people who think differently understand that they're not broken." That letter became the first in a correspondence that would continue for years, bridging the gap between a young girl learning to navigate her unique neurology and a soldier whose commitment to duty had been renewed by her example of courage in difference. Sophie's story spread quietly through autism advocacy networks, not as inspiration porn about overcoming disability, but as evidence that neurodivergent minds, when supported and understood, could contribute perspectives and insights that made everyone's world richer. And in the Royal Guard barracks, Harrison's account of his interaction with Sophie became part of the informal education that experienced soldiers provided to newcomers about the privilege and responsibility of serving the public. The reminder that their duty extended beyond protection to include recognition of the dignity and worth of every person they encountered. Years later, Sophie would join the military herself, not as a frontline soldier, but as a military historian and communications specialist whose unique attention to detail and pattern recognition would prove invaluable in intelligence analysis and strategic planning. But that morning at Buckingham Palace would always remain the turning point, the moment when a little girl with autism and a Royal Guard with years of training taught each other that strength comes in many forms. Communication transcends spoken language. And the most profound connections often happen between people who see the world through different lenses, but share the same commitment to dignity, respect, and focused presence. In the end, they had both learned something essential, that neurodiversity isn't a problem to be solved, but a resource to be cultivated. And that understanding across difference is always possible when people approach each other with genuine respect and willingness to learn. The conversation without words had said everything that mattered most.